Dear viewers, we have so far discussed that peasants in pre-independent India took up arms against colonial exploitation to protect their rights. The grievances of the tribal people were not different from those of the peasants. This video class is an attempt to give my viewers an overview of tribal movements in India. I am Orani Sekia from the Postgraduate Department of History, Nagaon College. Let's begin with the definition of a tribe. According to Imperial Gazetteer of India, a tribe is a collection of families bearing a common name, speaking a common dialect, occupying or professing to occupy a common territory and is not usually endogamous, though originally it might have been so. D.N. Majumdar defined tribe as a social group with territorial affiliation, endogamous with no specialization of functions, ruled by tribal officers, hereditary or otherwise, united in language or dialect, recognizing social distance with other tribes or castes. Lucy Mayer defined tribe as an independent political division of a population with a common culture. Tribal culture bears the unique identity of a tribal population. India is known for its tribal or Adivasi inhabitants. The term Adivasi connotes that they were the original inhabitants of the land, native to the soil. The tribal communities lived in relative seclusion for centuries. In spite of their contacts with the non-tribals, they maintained their separate identity. Each tribal community maintained its own socio-religious cultural life, political and economic organizations. Their culture provides them a sense of freedom and respect. It empowers them to stand united against any kind of exploitation by the outsiders. The tribal history of India is therefore abundant with stories of uprising against the exploiters as and when they caused any displeasure to the tribal population. There are several hundreds of tribes in India. Let me show only a few tribes of different regions in India. Let's look at the background of tribal movements in India. The tribal societies had a system of joint ownership of land, which was replaced in modern India by the notion of private property. Tribal society was traditionally egalitarian compared to mainstream society, which was marked by caste and class distinctions. With the coming of the outsiders, the tribals were given a lower rank in society. Social differentiation of the tribal population increased due to colonial interest. The tribals resented against extension of British rule to their areas. The revolts broke out among the Choas, Bhils, Khasis and Singhfos right from 19th century. The forests were of great significance for the tribals all over the country. They had customary rights to use the forest products. Their forest was the source of food and house construction. They grazed their cattle in the forest. The forest provided them with security. Their mainstay were shifting agriculture, hunting, fishing, and the use of forest resources. But with the setup of a forest department in 1864, the government started to have a control on the forest resources. The Forest Acts of 1865 and 1878 established total government monopoly. Restrictions were imposed on the use of forest products. The British forest policy received bitter response from the tribals as this led to the loss of their livelihood. Additionally, imposition of taxes on toddy added fuel to the aggrieved situation. The growing British control over forest zones for revenue purposes resulted revolts of Kukis, Oraons, and Chenchus in the early 20th century. Expansion of British revenue administration over tribal territories led to the loss of tribal peoples' hold over agriculture and forest land. They were reduced to landless agricultural laborers. Taking things worse, the British introduced moneylenders. This led to severe exploitation of the tribal people. They became bonded laborers under the new economic system. The tribal population came to believe that outsiders from the plains, whether moneylenders, traders, land grabbers, or contractors, they were all joined by the British administrators and local landlords in the exploitation. They saw their ancestral resources drained out. All sharpened the tensions within the tribal society. The Santal Rebellion in 1855 was particularly a revolt of oppression of landlords and village moneylenders. The Birsa Munda revolt was also directed against the outsiders, namely landlords, traders, and government officers. The Christian missions were active in some tribal belts. They spread modern Western education as well as the message of social equality. While doing so, they violated and often criticized the traditions and belief systems of the tribal people. The tribal people were dissatisfied with the so called reforming agenda of the Christian missionaries in their areas. They did not like the British effort to suppress some of their tribal traditions, so they fought to preserve their customs. There were the revolts of Mundas and Khons. British born Indian anthropologist and tribal activist Verrier Alwyn remarked that the chief cause of the tribal revolt was the loss of land and forests. The tribal communities complained against a violation of their hereditary rights in their regions. When the tribals found their demands to be ignored, they took to violent means of protest. The situation was further worsened by the fact that famines in the later half of the 19th century put the tribals into poverty. The coal insurrection of 1833 was caused by encroachment on tribal land. The Tamar rebellions, repeated 7 times between 1789 and 1832, were primarily due to the illegal deprivation of their rights in land. Similar were the cases of the Hos, Mundas, and Oraons. Now, let me summarize the causes of tribal movements in India. The British land settlements in India had eroded the tribal traditions of joint ownership and sharpened tensions within the tribal society. The activities of the Christian missionaries in the tribal areas created hostile reactions amongst the tribal. The tightening of government control over the forest zones, creation of reserve forests, and attempts to monopolize forest wealth through curbs on the use of timber and grazing facilities all caused great unrest among the tribals. The tribals also resented the introduction of general laws, which they considered as intrusions into their personal lives. The tribal people's sentiment was also adversely affected by socio-religious reform movements. Some of the tribal uprisings took place in reaction to the efforts of the landlords to enhance taxes on timber and grazing, police exactions, new excise regulations, exploitation by low country traders and moneylenders, and restrictions on shifting cultivation in forests. As we know, images depict history, rather, they are the sources of history. It is my attempt to give a pictorial representation of a few tribal movements in India. Now let's look at the nature of tribal movements in India. In 1976, the Anthropological Survey of India had identified 36 tribal movements. Significant tribal movements took place in the beginning of the 20th century. Most important among these was in the present Andhra Pradesh, where the tribals' forest agitation merged with Gandhi's non-cooperation movement, and subsequent to its withdrawal was carried further under the leadership of Sitarama Raju. According to Professor Sumit Sarkar, the spread of the movement was far beyond Andhra. The major tribal movements that have occurred in the modern India were mainly confined to central India, west central India, and Andhra. The northeastern frontier also witnessed tribal movements of considerable proportions. A notable feature of these tribal movements was that they occurred not in one or two pockets, but were spread out across the country and had at the root common or similar issues. Ranajit Guha categorized the tribal movements after independence as peasant movements. He observed that most of these movements have been characterized by a negative consciousness. It means more than their own consciousness as a class or social group. A consciousness based on an identification of the enemy played the vital role. The British policies created among the tribes and nomadic communities an extreme distrust of the authorities and turned them against the rulers. Teachings of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam often had as integral part of their teachings the promise of a paradise on earth for 1,000 years through divine intervention. This has been variously described as Messianism, Millenarianism, or Mahdism. Essentially, all these tribal movements were the outcome of deep resentment and discontent against the policies of British imperialists that adversely affected them. Let's look at the tribal movements in Northeast India. They mostly tended to remain aloof from the freedom struggle, often incorporating a demand for political autonomy either within India or as a separate unit. The Nagas, Mizos, and Boros led movements due to separatist tendencies. The factors that contributed to the development of a sense of a larger tribal identity were the Government of India Act 1935, the spread of modern education, and gradual emergence of a small and educated middle class among the tribes of the hills and plains. How did the tribals organize their movements? The tribals who were expert in guerrilla warfare mostly used weapons like bow and arrow to fight their enemies violently. For example, members of the Sura tribe of Andhra Pradesh revolted violently against the forest department. Some of the tribal movements are non-violent. For instance, in Bhagat movement and Kharwar movement in Bihar, tribals participated in the forest satyagraha in the 1930s. They demanded restoration of their customary rights to extract timber and collect forest produce for consumption. The British took help of force, mostly militant operations, for their suppression. At times, the government proposed conciliatory measures to put down the tribal revolts. We have come to the conclusion of this discussion. We have reflected on the issues of the tribal movements in general. The tribal movements in colonial India were born out of deep dissatisfaction and often discontent against the socio-economic policies of the British government, which adversely affected their lives. But what made them more aggrieved was the encroachment by outsiders into their independent tribal polity. So this is a tribal art, very nice tribal art. Thank you viewers for watching my video. Thank you.